I think one of the most interesting parts of retro gaming in recent times, when I say recent times, but we're really going back around 10 years ago now or so, is the rise of the mini console craze and the subsequent demise of the mini console craze around 2020 or 2021. Nintendo came out of nowhere and released the NES Classic at the tail end of the Wii U's demise, and it was really a genius idea. Now, I will say that Nintendo was not the first company to come up with mini consoles. It's been done before by companies such as Jakks Pacific, but the NES Classic was a genius idea by Nintendo. It was a shrunk down NES with 2 controllers with 30 built-in games. It was very, very successful. Nintendo produced and sold around 2.3 million NES Classic editions from launch through to April of 2017 alone, with shipments selling out immediately. And I remember back in the day, man, there were so many unhappy people that were not able to get an NES Classic, and there were a lot of scalpers on eBay selling them for like 3, even 4 times as much as what they were worth, which at the time was, I believe it was $59.99. $60 for an NES Classic with 30 games. That is incredible value for money. It's something that, if you think about in these days, 2026, it's unheard of that you could get that much value with just $60, because even AAA games, full price games, don't cost that much anymore. Now, the NES Classic sold out almost immediately, and Nintendo, I think is fair to say, they did not see the demand for these coming, and there were so many scalpers on eBay just reselling these. I was able to get an NES Classic, as you can see behind me here. I was very, very lucky to get one when they were made available at Target on their website. And I also ordered one, a Famicom Mini from, I think it was Play Asia, or one of the overseas sellers as well. But I got to admit, I was kind of caught up in the hype and the FOMO of these mini consoles. And even though I have both the NES Classic and the Famicom Mini, I got to be honest with you guys, I don't think I played a single game for more than like 5 minutes on either of these systems. Really, I just got them for making video content. And right now, they're just kind of mostly collectibles. And even now, when I have these like sitting here behind me, I can't think of a single time when I really sat down and played either of those systems. So it is interesting that I kind of got caught up in the hype, and as well as many others at the time. The NES Classic was just a cheap ARM-based SoC that ran Linux. It was quickly hacked and allowed for people to put hundreds of games on them, and it even allowed you to install other emulator cores, which is cool, right? Like, I think as someone that loves, open source and freedom, to do whatever you want with the hardware that you own, hacking these systems is really cool. And while it sold millions, Nintendo was criticized for the limited availability of the product. Now, in 2017, Nintendo said it was ceasing development of the NES Classic, which really met with a lot of confusion, but also speculation that the Super NES Classic was coming, which indeed it did. If you recall, towards the end of 2017, I believe it released at the end of September or maybe the start of October 2017. And this was essentially a follow-up to the NES Classic, but this time around it had 21 games. Given the price of many Super Nintendo games, having a system like this, a Super NES Mini or a Super NES Classic, that again had 21 games built in, that only cost, I think it was $79.99. It was a little bit more expensive than the NES Classic. And what made it even cooler, it came with the unreleased Star Fox 2, which made interest to hardcore Nintendo fans at an absolute peak. Now, I do admit at the time, I did play my Super NES Classic quite a bit. It was a fun diversion from console gaming at the time. I loved the ease of use. I loved the fact that it had very high quality emulation. And Star Fox 2 obviously was the icing on the cake. Now, the Super NES Classic ended up selling around 5 million units at the end of 2018. And it's said that both the NES and Super NES Classic sold a total of over 10 million units. This is massive. So for me, the Super NES Classic really was the peak of the mini console craze. It didn't get any bigger than this, although there was still some big things to come. I think the whole market really kind of topped out with the Super NES Classic. It was massive for the time, and it was really just a system that kind of complemented the Nintendo Switch. But the good times would not last, and this was not necessarily Nintendo's fault, more so from Sony PlayStation, because Sony PlayStation decided to throw their hat into the ring. Just like many other companies at the time, Sony released the PlayStation Classic in December of 2018, just in time for the holidays. And this was a emulation box just like the NES and Super NES Classic. But Sony also got a lot of criticism for using an open source emulation solution for their PlayStation Classic and not resorting to something that they had built in internally. And we do know that Sony had solutions for running PlayStation games internally, but also the system came bundled with 20 PlayStation games. Now on paper that sounds like a mouth-watering prospect, right? We got games such as Tekken 3, Resident Evil Director's Cut, and some other choice games, but these were all PAL versions and they all ran at 50 Hz. So games such as Tekken 3 ran famously slower on the PlayStation Classic than it does on original hardware. And there was also various omissions. There was no scanline filters, no shaders, there was no aspect ratio settings, but Sony really famously dropped the ball on the PlayStation Classic. And to kind of make matters worse for them, the scene kind of stepped in and hacked the PlayStation Classic in a matter of weeks. And it was possible to basically just set up your own games on the PlayStation Classic and do it that way. There was various open source, hacks such as, I think it was like Project Eris and Bleem Sync and Lolhack, various ways to run other PlayStation games on the PlayStation Classic, and of course, the ability to run different emulation cores as well. Now, Sega would also release a mini console in the form of the Sega Genesis Mini in 2019, and from an emulation standpoint, it was superb. This was because M2 was involved in the development of the software and the emulation for the product. Now, the system retailed for $79.99, but this time came with 40 titles with the inclusion of bonus games that were never originally released for the original Genesis or Mega Drive hardware. And for me, the Genesis Mini and the follow-up, the Genesis Mini 2, were technically the best mini consoles that you could get. But a few things were apparent by now. The Genesis Mini 2 featured over 50 games and even included Sega CD titles, again for $79.99. But by now, the market for mini consoles was shifting. In some ways, offering 50 games dilutes the value of each individual title. In addition, Sega had already released the Sega Genesis Classics that were available on most console and PC platforms, so many of these games were already available to people. So what ended up killing off the mini console craze? I think there's a couple of different reasons, and I definitely want to hear what you guys have to say on this, but first for me, I think Nintendo Switch Online, when it launched in September of 2018, it started out with a rolling list of NES games and then Super NES games. And then later on we added things like Genesis, Game Boy Advance, N64. But once you've got an active subscription and you're kind of invested in the Nintendo Switch ecosystem on a console that you already own, then the entire idea of the NES and Super NES classics kind of just evaporates, right? Like, what is the point of plugging in another box into your TV when you can play literally the same games on your Nintendo Switch and take that with you anywhere you like, right? And I think this is one of the reasons why Nintendo decided to discontinue or quickly discontinue both the NES and Super NES Classic, because they really felt like the NSO service was the main service to, serve up these old retro games. We've got also things like the Game Gear Micro, which released in 2020, which, while this was a really cute little idea, Sega ended up splitting 4 separate console SKUs, or these mini console SKUs, with 4 games each into a small screen that you couldn't even see, and you were kind of playing for a few minutes, but it wasn't even really worth the trouble, right? You had a lot of eye strain. It was more of a joke than anything else, but it also kind of signaled, I think, to the wider industry that anyone that was kind of thinking about getting into this space, the mini console space, had to really stop taking this seriously, because it felt like Sega was kind of at the end of, coming up with these mini consoles. The Game Gear Micro for me kind of represented the end of that craze as we know it. I think the enthusiast market as well also had a determining factor in this, because the enthusiast market had moved on. We're talking about companies such as Analog that ship things like the Mega SG, as well as the Mr. FPGA that really kind of has matured into a genuinely capable platform that does cycle accurate FPGA recreations of dozens of arcade systems, arcade boards, and home consoles. But there's also the handheld market that's also exploded. You've got the Ambinix, the AYNs, the Retroids, the GPD Wins. Suddenly, that represents better value for money than, say, the price of a Super NES Classic. So the mini console craze suddenly went from the darling of the video game industry, selling millions and millions, just being snapped up everywhere, selling out everywhere, to kind of the worst option in almost every direction in just a few years, right? It's less convenient than the Nintendo Switch Online service, or playing retro games on like AntStream, for example, on your Xbox. It's less accurate than the Mister or an analog product. It's less flexible than a cheaper handheld device. And the technical case for it just collapsed. It ended up just being something cool for collectors. And it's one of the reasons why I don't really play my mini consoles. And I think a lot of us out there that did get into that moment where we ended up buying up these products, we don't really use them either anymore. Now, that's not to say that mini consoles are completely dead, but I think these days they are much more of a niche market. You've still got products from Retro Games Limited from the UK that released the C64 Mini, the A500 Mini, which is the mini Amiga 500 computer, the Atari 400 Mini. But even Retro Games Limited and these companies are coming up with full recreations of these systems. So you've got the Spectrum, you've got Commodore with the C64 Ultimate, you've also got the A1200, which is a full-size Amiga 1200. So even these companies are realizing the limitations of the mini consoles, the mini computers, that they're not really as relevant as they used to be. And in many ways, I feel like we're going full circle, re-releasing or recreating these old systems, these old computers and old consoles. We talked about the Neo Geo AES Plus last week, and this seems like where the market is right now, being able to recreate these systems in their entirety and have them play original games and use original peripherals, I think is what is very, very hot right now. But what's hot right now may not be hot in a couple of years from now. But they are just my thoughts and opinions. What do you think about the mini console craze? It kind of lasted around 5 or so years. It was definitely an interesting time, and I don't think we really talk about it as much as we used to. But sometimes I hear people say, I'd love to see a Dreamcast Mini or a Sega Saturn Mini come out. I think the window for that kind of stuff is definitely closed at this point. And, if we are to see something, I'd rather see some type of recreation device or some type of FPGA device that plays these games with a lot more accuracy. But they're just my thoughts and opinions. Let me know your experiences with mini consoles back in the day. I definitely want to hear what you guys have to say. But for now, we are going to leave it here for today's episode. Thank you so much for watching, and we will catch you guys in the next episode. Bye for now.